In episode 68, titled Evaluate Readiness with the RAR, we use the Readiness Assessment Report, RAR, to take a disciplined first look at where a program truly stands on the road to FedRAMP authorization. The RAR is a flashlight, not a verdict. It shines on the essentials early enough to steer investment and sequencing before formal assessment mechanics lock in. Done well, it prevents expensive surprises, shortens the path to credible testing, and builds shared understanding among engineering, security, leadership, and the sponsoring agency. Think of it as a pre-flight inspection for assurance. We are verifying that the aircraft exists as described, the logbooks are legible, the gauges are alive, and the runway is clear. When the RAR becomes habit, readiness stops being a feeling and starts reading like evidence. The purpose of the RAR is clarity, and clarity arrives as an early snapshot against core capability expectations rather than a deep dive certification. A credible RAR asks whether the building blocks for continuous control operation and later verification are genuinely present. It confirms that inventories enumerate what will be managed, that boundary descriptions reflect reality, and that baseline controls exist in operational form rather than as aspirational prose. Because the RAR precedes formal testing, it trades breadth for speed and uses pragmatic indicators to decide if the program can proceed. That is the value: catching structural gaps while they are cheap to fix, sequencing foundational work ahead of showpiece efforts, and giving sponsors a defensible rationale for any schedule adjustments. A neutral view matters, so engage a third-party assessment organization, 3PAO, to conduct structured readiness interviews and targeted evidence reviews. The role here is not to grade. It is to validate that claims are anchored in artifacts and that key people can explain how controls operate day to day. Interviews should span governance owners, identity administrators, logging and monitoring leads, vulnerability management operators, and platform engineers. Short, focused walkthroughs of representative systems beat sprawling workshops every time. Ask for show-me moments tied to living consoles, tickets, and repositories, then capture links and identifiers rather than screenshots alone. When the 3PAO can independently navigate from a statement to proof, the RAR moves from conversation to confirmation. Readiness hinges on whether the authorization boundary, inventories, and interconnections are understood and recorded with traceability. The boundary should be more than a diagram. It should map components, data flows, and external services to stable identifiers that match the inventory of assets and configurations. Interconnections must list partners, trust modes, and the evidence that each connection is governed: agreements, approvals, and monitoring hooks. The inventory must reconcile with discovery sources, so no class of compute, storage, or service is invisible. This is the backbone of everything that follows. If the boundary wobbles or inventories shift under scrutiny, sampling becomes guesswork, and later findings will read like clerical errors rather than control truths. The RAR's job is to make that backbone visible and believable. A practical readiness lens focuses on a handful of key control areas: identity, logging, vulnerability management, and encryption basics. For identity, verify enforced least privilege, role definitions, and joiner, mover, leaver processes with evidence of recent changes and approvals. For logging, confirm central collection, format normalization, and retention rules, along with at least a few detections that map to privilege misuse, segmentation bypass, or exfiltration. For vulnerability management, require proof of authenticated scans with coverage counts and success rates tied to the inventory. For encryption, check transport parameters, storage protections, and key management roles with operating evidence rather than policy text. If these 4 pillars exist and function reliably, the later assessment can test depth. If they do not, the RAR correctly redirects energy to foundations first. Many programs plan to inherit security from providers, so the RAR must validate inheritance claims with actual provider documents and attestation references. Record which controls are inherited, the specific provider statements or reports that support them, and the mapping from provider evidence to your boundary. Confirm that inherited evidence is current, applicable to your regions and services, and addressed in your system security plan with the correct parameters. Where inheritance stops, show how your controls resume responsibility. An honest inheritance check shrinks scope for the right reasons and prevents the awkward moment later when a control assumed covered by the platform turns out to be yours after all. The RAR's role is to turn "we inherit this" into "we can point to it." The heart of readiness is converting what you learn into gaps, risks, and realistic remediation timelines. Gaps are concrete absences, no inventory tags for a class of assets, unauthenticated scans on a critical tier, or logging without retention controls. Risks are the plausible consequences of those gaps under your operating reality. Timelines should be grounded in dependencies, engineering capacity, change windows, vendor lead times, and the time it takes to refresh evidence credibly. A good RAR expresses this as a short backlog with owners, target dates, and the artifacts that will prove closure. Precision here is not ceremony. It is how sponsors decide whether to proceed, pause, or change the route. A frequent pitfall is treating the RAR as either a formal assessment or a guaranteed authorization preview. It is neither. It does not produce pass-fail grades, and it does not bind a later 3PAO to a future opinion. The RAR is a readiness gate that says whether the system is prepared for efficient, credible testing. Over-interpreting it creates false comfort on one side and unnecessary defensiveness on the other. Keep the RAR scoped to readiness questions. Can we sample? Can we authenticate? Can we correlate evidence? And keep formal judgment for the assessment that follows. When participants respect this boundary, the RAR remains fast, honest, and widely trusted. One practical boost is to prioritize fixes that improve sampling coverage and testing ease, even ahead of some control refinements. Enforced inventory tagging, stable asset identifiers, consistent environment labels, and authenticated scanning on representative tiers multiply later effort. They make every interview sharper, every pull request more informative, and every finding easier to replicate and close. Likewise, small logging improvements, normalizing timestamps, aligning user identifiers across layers, and hardening retention settings pay off across multiple control families. The RAR should call out these accelerators explicitly so teams spend their next unit of effort on changes that lower the cost of all subsequent work. Consider a realistic scenario that often surfaces: missing or inconsistent inventory tags across a subset of hosts and services. The RAR notes that scans cannot map findings to owners or environments reliably, and dashboards disagree with ticketing counts. The recommendation is immediate enforcement at provision time via policy checks, retroactive reconciliation using discovery sources, and automation that stamps tags consistently across compute, containers, and managed services. The pipeline then captures configuration snapshots, confirms tags in authoritative inventories, and shows authenticated scan success per asset class. Within a cycle or two, coverage becomes demonstrable, and triage turns from manual detective work into routine assignment. That is a textbook RAR win: foundational, fast, and durable. The deliverable from a readiness exercise is a concise report that summarizes strengths, gaps, and recommended actions with the minimum narrative needed to steer decisions. It should begin with boundary and inventory confidence, list the status of the key control areas, and present a short, prioritized remediation plan. Each recommendation names an owner, a target date range, and the specific artifact that will prove completion: configuration exports, scan summaries, log settings, or provider attestations. Keep the pros clear, avoid jargon, and resist over-documenting edge cases. The measure of a good RAR report is whether engineers know what to do Monday and sponsors know what support to provide Tuesday. Socializing outcomes with the sponsor is part of the work, not an afterthought. Walk through the boundary confidence, the inheritance confirmations, and the short remediation list. Then align expectations for schedule, staffing, and any policy decisions that affect sequencing. If the RAR reveals that a pause is prudent before formal assessment, make that case professionally with evidence and options. Immediate accelerators, near-term milestones, and the date a re-readiness check will occur. Sponsors value programs that tell the truth early and show a plan. Credibility earned here carries into every later meeting with agencies and authorizing officials. A simple readiness mini-review keeps the team aligned as it moves from findings to action. Boundary, controls, inheritance, gaps, plan, alignment. Boundary asks whether the authorization map and inventories agree. Controls asks whether identity, logging, vulnerability management, and encryption basics operate credibly with evidence. Inheritance asks whether provider claims are current, specific, and mapped. Gaps asks which absences matter most and why. Plan asks who owns what with which proof and by when. Alignment asks whether sponsors and leaders agree on resources and cadence. Say the 6 steps aloud at each checkpoint, and the RAR will keep pointing at what matters. In conclusion, readiness has been assessed, and the results are a focused roadmap rather than a verdict. The RAR provided the early snapshot against core expectations, validated boundary and inheritance, highlighted gaps with realistic timelines, and aligned sponsors to support the path forward. The immediate next action is execution. Take the top remediation items, especially those that unlock sampling coverage, authenticated scanning, and logging normalization, and move them to done with proof attached. When those pieces click into place, formal assessment becomes faster, clearer, and far more likely to end in an authorization decision grounded in evidence rather than optimism. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.